So, is this working okay now? You can hear me at the back. Good, thank you. Well, firstly, can I say it's a great pleasure and privilege to be here. Thank you to my hosts. It's a real treat. I've never been to Porto before, so this is a very special occasion for me, and also to see this magnificent school. I'm going to do two things. I'm going to talk about some themes that are very interesting for me and recur in some of the projects that my office is making. 10 themes, just be very quick, about 10 or 15 minutes. Then I'm going to show some projects where some of these ideas are, shall we say, at play in greater or lesser ways. I call this talk "Making Urban," and I would say it's an idea. These themes are all urban themes in a way, but they're urban themes where architecture is entangled with these ideas that there is for me, no real difference between architecture and urbanism. Even the design of a house, a small house, certainly an apartment building on a street, buildings have a kind of duty to their wider context. You could say, without making it sound overly serious, a sort of responsibility. And 2 and 3 and 4 houses contribute together. So I think even the making of a single small project and its interaction with the public realm is a key idea. So let me see, how's this work? Yeah. Is that right? This one?
Yeah. Very good.
Can use this if you're on. Okay. I'm going to use this. Okay, I'll do it. A little technical hitch there. So, wanted to begin with this idea: intimacy, proximity, and conviviality. It's a photograph I've been looking at for many years, and something I really love about this. It's a very ordinary London street taken in the 19th century, and it's for me a very powerful image. The distance between the street in relation to the height of the buildings, but also the power and presence of the entrances that sit opposite the street, and they have a kind of strong orientation. They look at each other. And this is, of course, these porches are details of the house, but they're also very strong devices in the city for making connection across this city street. In a similar way, in a kind of more intimate way, this image always strikes me for, you don't see it at first, but the very strong design sense of these facades, their windows, the shutters, and the idea that the space between these houses is a very strong communal space. And perhaps you could imagine that these houses were not designed, of course, but the making of these houses is as much about the making of the space between the houses. The threshold of these buildings are an integral part, of course, of this, and I just wanted to show this fantastic Dutch painting. This is a very common scene, of course, and it's present today in the way that these Dutch houses are very strongly articulated with questions of threshold, height. There's a kind of richness, and this is both a part of the entrance experience and sequence of moving into these dwellings, but they're also stages and pieces of theatre in relation to the street. Simple railing becomes a seat. This is an idea that, as I was saying in my introduction, that one house is more than the simple component of itself. Of course, you receive a job to design a house, and you're there to serve the client and the brief, and of course you're thinking very hard about the design of the house and the spaces and how it's going to provide the accommodation. But it also has a role in the city, and this is an image I really enjoy. Some rather fancy houses in South Kensington in London, but you can see how the sequence of porches, when looked at collectively, form a kind of grand colonnade. It's not a colonnade, of course, but the experience of entering one's house has a feeling that you could say a kind of pleasure beyond the single porch of the house. And in a similar way, I'm sure many of you recognize this project. It's in the city of Bath in England. It's the Royal Crescent. It's a kind of palace, you could say. It's a palace on the top of the hill, but it's not really a palace. It's actually a series of individual houses. And what I think is very striking about this project, when you look very closely, you see that although there's a strong idea of repetition in the composition of the facade, you see, if you look closely, the distance between windows. If I could point here, between this door and the next door, you have a group of 3 windows, and then here you have 4 and 3 and 2, and yet the big gesture of this piece of architecture is one thing. And I think what's very interesting about it is you could say it touches onto an idea of tolerance and accommodation, accommodates individuality within this big gesture of the city. So I said that most of these themes are really about city and urban. And this is an idea, it's deliberately spelt in the French manner, this idea of city within city. When we make projects and we're having to integrate ourselves into a wider city fabric, we're often confronted by ideas of connection and integration, but at the same time, this is a béguinage in Belgium, which is essentially a kind of protected housing scheme done in the 17th century. Here it is in plan. But you see from this drawing how it's really a wider piece of the city fabric. But within that city fabric, within the urban block, is carved a space, a very calm space, a very strong space. So it's at once part of the city, and at the same time it's something which is quite unto itself. It's a kind of city within the city. And here's another example of this idea. This housing scheme in Brussels has a kind of wholeness, a kind of connected, collective sense of one. And I think in my mind it's a kind of promoting the collective above the individual, without denying the individual a sense of let's say, special individual character. And this is quite something in cultures like the UK and Belgium, nations where a sense of kind of individuality is held very strong. City of houses, both London and Belgium, cities of houses. Perhaps it's a kind of different idea in places like France, where the collective was somehow much more recognized in the 18th century than it was in our country. The idea that people know they have to organize things in a way that serves everybody. I touched on this, but this theme is really about tolerance. As architects, we design things, we fall in love with them. We can be rigid sometimes, like I don't want my project changing in time. And I really like this photograph because it's, as you see here, it's a set piece. Is my mic working okay? A little bit more volume. Can you hear me at the back okay? Yeah? Put your hand up if you can't. Okay. This is a very modest project. It's a row of English houses. And, you know, you might say this spoils it. Or does it? And this spoils it, maybe. Or does it allow, you know, this system allows change. And, but it allows change within some rules, some broad rules of material continuity and compositional division somehow. So I think this is an image in my mind that represents an idea of tolerance, repetition in the houses with these little variations. And this is another, I suppose, way of describing that. These are a series of fishing net huts on the south coast of England. Very famous, I'm sure you've seen these images. But what I like about these, what I think is very special is the way that, in fact, they're all different. Everyone is different. But at the same time, they're kind of the same. They're all made from the same stuff. Timber, painted with black oil tar. They've all got pointy roofs, but they shuffle around in the crowd. They orientate in different ways. And I think it's another example in my mind about how we can embrace a sort of tolerance within an overall idea. This is a strange title, and I never quite know how to say this. So I'm going to have a go. Every lecture I do on this, I say it slightly differently, but this is which we call windows within walls, but it's about cities, and it's about the character of cities, and it's about the significance of windows. And their windows are amazing things, and somehow windows are to buildings what, I don't know, air is to humans. Somehow they're like fundamental to the kind of function somehow. And I know some of you are thinking, well, some buildings don't have windows, but I'm talking about city buildings, the kind of majority of cities, housing buildings, office buildings, and so on. And I'm always very struck about the way different cultures make, how somehow either the material, the substance, brick in the case of Amsterdam, the culture of window making at a particular time in history, really define the architecture of the city. This could be nowhere else but Amsterdam. English houses from the 18th century have windows a bit like this, but really, actually, when you look closely, the windows are more set deeper into the facade. The brickwork of English buildings tend not to be painted or coloured. But yeah, I'm going on about this because it's significant. I think the project we're making here in Porto this week is really about Porto, and I suppose what we've been trying to do is to get under the skin of a city that I and I think most of the students in the group don't know or haven't really been to. And it's interesting as an architect when you have a commission in a place to try to understand what it is that makes the place the spirit it is. And it's obvious things, but it's quite subtle things, and sometimes you have to look very close and see that, well, you know, here we have facades where the buildings are very frame-like, the facades are very frame-like. There's more window than wall. The ratio of window to wall is very distinct. If this was an image of Paris, you would know instantly it's Paris, or Lyon, the character, the presence of the masonry in relation to the windows. And this is this is clearly New York City. And why? Because we recognize the buildings through the bay window as being a kind of tinted brick. The more or less vertical proportion of the windows are derived from Holland and UK, century before. So it's interesting in my mind how these things transition from cultures. I mean, this is unmistakably English buildings, London buildings from the 18th century. These windows, they have characteristics like those Dutch windows, but they're organized differently, they're more regular. English terrace houses like this were often made by one developer or one builder, would just do one terrace, not two or three, often just one. The Dutch terraces on the canals are all individual developers or owners. There's only three more, so bear with me. Urban figuration is also about architecture and urban design. Now, I'm sure many of you who have seen lectures by the particular kind of school of architects from London will recognize this this photo, because I think we all use it, but actually in different ways. It's Chandos House by Robert Adam in central London. And what I like to say about this, if you look at this building very carefully, you'll see that not only is the entrance not centered on the facade, but the windows have a kind of, you see the panel of stone between the windows have an ever so slight increase in proportion. And is this an accident? Why did he do this? Why did he do this? It's a strange thing to do. It's somehow, perhaps it's part of a, shift, let's say, a kind of orientation. So this idea that architecture can have a, form and facade can have orientation, a kind of, you see when you look at this site, here is Chandos House in the city, and you notice that actually it sits at the end of Chandos Street, like this, and here's the porch, looking to the left. And, well, I would describe the way in which the facade has the power to, and the possibility to give direction. It kind of tells you something's happening at the end of this street that's not what you might think. Here's another example, the Belgian Embassy in London, where when you see this plan, you see how actually the building is part of this more or less grid of building forms, but is then cut by Grosvenor Crescent. And the architect, save that one. The architect was looking for ways to adjust his building to the street, and he does this just by this very sleight of hand turning of the porch. So these are not big ideas, they're obvious ones, simple and subtle touches between the act of building and the city. And then I just wanted to also say that sometimes buildings can give our cities things, and Alberti knew that in a way. It's wonderful. I'm sure you all know this building, but the wonderful way the pilasters drop down onto the backrest onto the plinth, and the plinth, of course, is part of the pavement and the seat. This is a very nice urban example of architecture gifting the city something very special. This is, if I just go forward 2 slides, this is part of the law courts in London. So you have this great, beautiful court. Then in the corner, you have a little passage that connects to the rest of the city here. And here the architect, regular Georgian facade installed. There's a bookshop, and the bookshop is essentially a lining to a passage. And it's very clever, really, because it's sort of obvious, but clever, I think, because the passage is gifted the, let's say, the presence of luminance at night and its interest, you could say. And the bookshop is given this fantastic decorative entrance through this otherwise very ordinary piece of London facade. And then, almost finally, well, lots of architects have used this phrases with these two words, but I like this, and it sort of feels like should be of our time. We live in a period of gross excess and vulgarity, and I think practicing architects today, we're confronted by the problem of having too much on our plate. Materials in the 19th century, the 18th century, you would build with brick if you're in London because that's what you had, and you would make sash windows because that. But I like the idea of being economical, and I just use this image of Paris Metro, which I like very much because it's, I mean, it's a simple connecting of tubes, the train tube, the pedestrian link to the lower levels, which derives this incredibly complex geometry. And I like very much the way this cheap and simple use of tile is the thing that holds together this immense complexity. And finally, and this is still urban in a way, although not looking it, but these photographs by the American photographer McCartney show this very nice and simple idea about how land can have dual uses. For some hours of the day, it's a supermarket car park, and when it's shut, it's something else. This is a different kind of way of saying it, but the fields are cleaned of stones, and the stones define the boundaries of the fields, sometimes a building for the animals. But there's a fantastic reciprocity going on here between land and form. And a final image on that idea, these fields in Chur in Switzerland are both vineyards and sheep grazing. So let's get on with this. This is the first project I wanted to show you, and I'm going to race through these quite quickly. Whoops, they're not, I'm not showing projects in their wholeness, but snapshots of projects that contain some of these ideas. This is a project we're just finishing in Antwerp, in Belgium. It sits in this neighbourhood. It's in a neighbourhood called Cadix. It's in the inner docks, and it was master planned about 10 years ago. A lot of new buildings, but a lot of existing buildings to be integrated. And there was a very nice master plan produced in 2001 that sought to somehow hold on to the spirit of this this dock workers neighbourhood. So here you have the dock and the other dock, and the main body, the centre of the city down off the bottom of the page. And we won this competition to make a building, a corner building. It's an urban building. But this neighbourhood is very, it's not the most kind of amazing architectural place, but it represents, I suppose, a time when landowners or storage buildings were more than simply boxes. They had a pride to make something with the simple facades, and these pictures just sort of give a sense of the place, the existing sense of the place that was undergoing a lot of regeneration, a lot of new buildings, a lot of architects working in this neighbourhood. And We like the really gritty nature. It reminded me of Tribeca in New York in the early 80s, these cobbled streets, these very wide streets. The light is really sparkly because of the light on the water. And then these somewhat disused buildings. So we got to work on this housing building. It's essentially it's an L-shaped building, so it occupies the southwest corner of the block. It's essentially a series of houses, 3-story houses with 2-story duplexes on top of them, and an apartment building here entered from the corner. And the transition between these two typologies comes together in this seat and this light for kind of teenagers hanging out or whatever. And really, this seems obvious, but we were not asked to make entrances on the street. The brief actually was for an apartment building, but one of the things we enjoyed doing was to try to make a series of houses with front doors and kitchen windows, and that these would somehow be that the pavement comes directly up to here. It's not quite finished in this photo. So what you're looking at here is a series of 3-story houses with duplexes on top. And there's an interest in my office in finding a way to compose, take this program and find a way to compose it in a series of arrangements. So what you're looking at here is actually the expression of a 2-story volume behind this facade. Two tight levels. You come clear in this section right here. You see, so there is the street with the canopy, and then you have a kitchen which is very squeezed, and then this big space at the back onto the garden, and its bedrooms on top, little study room up here, and then another duplex up here, access from the deck. So there was a they hate deck access, and you know, deck access in London. You're seeing an image here. Was very difficult to convince them it could still be a nice thing, because it had a lot of bad press, deck access, in the 70s and 80s. So you're looking here through this double height space into the garden at the rear, and the entrance through to the back. So here in this long elevation, you're seeing these houses. These are 3-story houses, duplexes, then returning to the corner. We like to work a lot with models in my office, as my students here have seen this week. I think I like to make models myself still. I think it's an important tool for architects. I know it's not very fashionable anymore with the use of computers, CGIs. All my friends say to me, why do you bother? Because you can do the same with CGIs. And you kind of can, but there's something about the process of making and thinking that's slow. And we're all having to work so fast these days. I like the idea of making and changing your mind, and also making images and looking at models is very different to looking at a one-point CGI. Now, I know you're saying, well, you could do a video fly-through, but again, I think there's something very special about holding a physical thing and looking at it from different vantage points. So this is a view of the building on the corner, where it transfers from houses to apartments and rises to a series of apartments on the roof with this, could say, castle-like top. So it's a city building that's trying to, in a way, gift back to the city something in the form of this. I mean, I have to, you know, acknowledge the Amsterdam Dutch School. A bit louder. How's that? Is that better? Is that better? Everybody, wave. Can you hear me at the back? Wave if you can't. Good. Amsterdam Dutch School. I'm not going to go there just now. Right. So, more of that. they were amazing architects, the way they, and very brief period in history, the way they shaped, and they worked a lot with models, and the way they shaped form out of brick was, for me, the most extraordinary, maybe one of the most extraordinary period of 20th century architecture. So here you're looking at a drawing. I still love flat drawings and elevations and plans. I think in the school where I teach in London, it's very unfashionable to make two-dimensional drawings. But they say things to us that 3D images don't, I think. You can understand a project in a plan in a way that, or a plan contain ideas that that an image doesn't. Somehow you can thump an idea forward with a plan. I'm not saying it's the only way, but it's certainly still a very important way. So, maybe my colleague said it's a bit tedious to show plans in lectures. But anyway, I won't leave it on the screen too long. But this is the plan at the upper level. You saw the plan at low level. And at the upper level, you see this deck access feeding the first level of these duplexes. And there's a view of it. And looking back into the apartment is access from a kind of Golden Lanes style kind of generous deck space. And the idea about these, that's looking back there, the idea about these decks is they're very deep. So they not only give access to the apartments above, but they, maybe if I go back to this, they allow, in plan, they bellow out in this manner and allow a kind of swelling in front of the entrance for a kind of informal appropriation of the space. So there you're looking down at the back of the three-story houses. So I'm going to race through this one. At the same time as doing this project in Belgium, we've been making this master plan. My office is doing very small projects, but also large-scale master plan projects. And this is a master plan for a part of London up here. It's called the Nightingale Estate. It's a project that seeks to make streets and squares and terraces. It sits here in Stoke Newington in London. It has a little square here and a big square here. I have to say, it's there was a period of a great period of mansion block building around the turn of the century, when London's house scale houses were developers and politicians were looking to increase housing, and in some ways it's looking at this period. These are some very beautiful, it's called the Samuel Lewis building, very beautiful mansion blocks. But the site that we had used to have these towers on. Actually, they were not bad, these towers, but the politicians, a lot of crime and trouble on these estates, and they become very unpopular, and the politicians decided that they have to be taken away. But the new project should seek the same quantum of development, but they won't have towers. So they were, before I got involved in this project, because I might have protested, this is not very sustainable to knock buildings down like this. So they were taken away. Here is this site. It's in the London Borough of Hackney. Here's the City of London. And it's interesting to look at this piece of city. In the turn of the century, it was a very, already a very dense part of the city. This was bombed during the war, and the towers that you saw were there. And so I suppose in a way our vision in this project is to return to a kind of tight grain idea of, let's say, a distinct piece of city. The existing site is very characterized by a great variety of building types, everything from towers to slab blocks to small terraces. And what we felt this project needed was something very clear and strong and coherent even though, its edges were somewhat irregular and arbitrary, just given the plot. we thought it could be a new vision for how all this would develop in time. So it's essentially quite unforgiving series of north-south streets, meaning the apartments get east and west light, with south faces here onto the park, and then a building that has these east face gables onto this little public green up here. And some of the ideas that I was showing you in Antwerp are at play in this project, in the way that this is a primary route through the estate. But by the way, one tower, I didn't mention that, but one tower had to stay, and there is this weird absorbing of a tower here, an existing tower that's then held and contained within this block. But a principal route, the building here is orientating east to this park, making a series of little courts here, a series of little articulations. This is a public route through, whereas these are semi-public. So on the outside of the block, I said it's north-south, and so you don't see it in this plan. There's a series of bay windows down this side, giving a kind of southern orientation. So again, using models to study these pieces of architecture. Here we have we've been talking about non-referential architecture the other night, and this is really the opposite position, and somehow everything's been done well before. We just, as a new generation, I don't see how we can help but to kind of touch it. And so, you know, this is the Palais Royal in Paris. This is my Palais Royal moment through to the garden here. It's the outside of the block with balconies and corner articulations. This is a cross-section you see in this diagram here through one of these courts. So this is a bit like the Belgian project, a series of two-story houses with a series of apartments on a kind of gallery deck here. This is looking through. These are all brick buildings. These decks are very deep and they allow informal occupation. So there's the elevation. So I'm really just focusing on one of the buildings in the master plan, the one that orientates onto the little square here. And there's a view looking onto these gardens. This is a semi-private space belonging to these residents. So you have two of these that sit next to each other, and this series of, in this model, you're saying two, but there are four of these gables that orientate here onto the park. Connected, similar. This is a different project, but there's a lot of the same themes at play. It's a master plan and the development of 900 homes in part of North London. It was a commission we received 2 years ago. It's a commission that we are collaborating with two other practices in London, Surgeon Bates, Allies and Morrison. We developed this master plan, which is also premised on this north-south streets. So streets here, inner courts here, there's another street, but with a slight difference to the other project, where the shifting in the plan makes for these kind of shoulders, let's say. And these shoulders become highly articulated moments in the plan. Here is a major existing street, here is a church, and here's a public space. And so what we're seeing here is a theme in the master plan about how the way buildings react to junctions. So it's part of a big London-wide mayoral study we have a major housing crisis in London, and this will be one of the sites that is there to deliver a large number of housing. It's right on the railway station, so it's 10 minutes here to Euston. So it's because of that, it's classified as a site that should take a much greater density than it's had in the past, because what you see around here is really a kind of suburbia. So it's also a kind of city within the wider city, and it's the characteristic of this city is predominantly 5-story urban buildings. And here is a drawing that tries to articulate this idea of the buildings here in purple, and they step, and you get these kind of knuckle points, these shared spaces where the buildings have to perform in a way that perhaps they don't have to perform in the same way on the long elevation. So they have to really kind of rise to their occasion, at their moment in the city. It's a very complex project. It's going on. It's probably a 5-year project. I'm really just skimming the surface, but there's a lot of input from transport and highways, looking carefully about how cars move through this space, how to accommodate cars. So here you're seeing some of these little moments in the buildings where they sneak forward. So phase 1 of this 1,000 homes consists of these 5 buildings here. And these 5 buildings are about to be submitted to planning next week. Here's a zoom in of that bit. So you're seeing a building here. These are by different architects. This is by my office. This is by my office. This is by Surges and Bates. And the one just up here is also by Surges and Bates. We're wrestling with how to, these are building designs, but space designs. We're very interested in these mansion blocks from the 19th century. This is Norman Shaw, fantastic apartment building overlooking Hyde Park. Here's an elevation of the southern building overlooking the square. All the east-facing buildings have arcades. They're all made from brick and precast elements here. So I'm going to move scale. This is a small project. We call it Moore Park Road. It's also in London. It's in Fulham. And it's the spirit of this kind of urban intimacy is at play in this project. It's a small project for 4 houses on a ridiculously small and difficult site. You see 5 houses in this model, but then we were told we couldn't do that by the authorities. It's too much, overdeveloped, blah, blah. So it's now 4. And it's a series of houses that sit cheek by jowl. And it's I suppose the spirit of this project enjoys the kind of, you could say slightly nostalgically, the world that used to exist in these inner urban blocks. So our site is this one here. And in the 19th century, typically it's not unfamiliar to Porto in some ways. You have the city edge buildings here. These are houses, and all these houses have backyards, so coming to this line. And then you get these leftover bits. And these were often used to service the rest of the adjacent city. So they might have had horses and carts and coal and storage and so on. They were workshops, and they looked a bit like this. That's how it used to look like. So gaps and buildings, informal buildings, all a bit cheek by jowl. And our client bought this site a long time ago, actually. So he's held on to it, and now he's developing it. So it's been on site for 6 months. In fact, this project, I'd say it's kind of ridiculously impossible. You access through this little narrow passageway like that you saw in the first picture, and you enter into this triangular plot, which was built previously. So over the century, it's been built, and when we got to work on this project, this is what existed on the site. It was essentially all built. It had accumulated ramshackle buildings. So we thought about a concept where we take pieces away, and our client wanted us to build houses, not apartments. That was the only economic model for this. So we developed this idea that we would remove bits, not literally. This was a kind of, in the end, they're new buildings, but that we would take pieces away and enjoy the gaps between, and try and generally put the gaps on the southeast, southwest side of the plot, So there you see an aerial view of what existed. This has all been taken away now. There's 5, but now 4 houses. So here's a plan, 4 houses. Access through here. They're 3-story houses. This is a plan at the middle level, so you enter in the middle. You enter onto this common brick surface that should be very beautiful. Series of trying to recycle some of the material that came from the existing building to make a series of, let's say, carpets. And these carpets are brick carpets that would, I should combine those drawings. I don't know why I didn't do that, but they would bring access to these dwellings. So here's a cross-section. So in fact, the lower level cuts into the ground a little bit. The land around the site varies. So you've entered into this level, so you go up to bedrooms and down to living spaces. There's the living spaces. So actually, although there are 4 separate houses, you could also describe it as a kind of horizontal apartment building that at this level is all built, but then pops up. At this level it joins, they join together. So here's an early model study. And there's the upper level. So it's a very simple plan of two bedrooms. And they're brick buildings that have white bricks at lower level, and these 2 bricks come together in these tight courtyards, which are very small and difficult, you could say. So this project, how am I doing for time? 1 or 2 more? Okay, stop me. So this project is also in London. It's 2 houses, just 2 houses, but it's on a very interesting and difficult site here. This is the site, and it's there's a railway line that's at low level, cuts through here, and there's a railway line at upper level, now not an active line. But the site was, these houses here are from the turn of the century, and they stopped here because at that time they couldn't build. This is a cutting, an embankment, but they couldn't make a building here then. But now with modern piling, it's deemed a building plot, and so our client bought it, and the regulations allowed us to go a little bit closer. So here you see the project in plan. You see how it's a kind of, it's like the tail end of this street now. And for me, this is an urban project. It has an urban aspiration in that this road junction here, it's very, unpromising site, with all these roads coming together. Not major roads, but and the opportunity to build on this corner was one to compress the space a bit more, bringing the building face right to the pavement, finding devices to deal with threshold because of bringing the buildings to the face. The planners wanted us to push the building right to the back and have land in the front, but we argued that that was not good for the city or the urban junction. It would be better, it would be more exciting, more contained, more dynamic somehow if the buildings could come forward. You enter, if you're coming from the south, you come under this railway line here, like that, and then you met with the corner. So here it's continuing the terrace, turning the corner, making a little tower-like experience. Now you see turning the corner here. It's a model, early model study. Here you see joining up with the existing buildings, making a little friend here to this character, playing with this language that is really, this neighborhood is, well, it's an Edwardian, not Victorian, in fact, so it was all built around 1895 to 1905. It was built not with architects, but developers who were following patterns and techniques. This is a particularly nice one just up the road, where you have this entrance and this living room window all kind of contained, embraced. So we tried to do something like this. There you're looking at the back. The backs were always a bit more irregular, and the chimneys, they have fireplaces with wood-burning stoves here at the bottom. And they all have, I didn't really speak about it, but they have double height. They have, let's say they have our client's called Solid Space, and they have a kind of preoccupation with split level, which we don't. But they were pushing very hard that living, dining, kitchen should somehow, it's a very small plot, this, but he pushed us to try to, you'll see in that image is it? Oh no, maybe it's coming here. To try to make spaces that would interact with each other across a level chain. So here you have the kitchen to the left, the dining, the living, and that was the quality he was very keen. That made for quite complex staircases, especially on this irregular and difficult shaped site. So I think I'm just going to race through that one, but that is, this is another kind of city within the city, very small. It's a kind of beguinage. It's a series of little houses that, a bit like this one, a series of little houses that wrap a small space. It sits in a kind of wilderness of strange city that's not very urban, quite suburban, busy road. And what we wanted to do here with our clients is to really push the buildings to the boundary of the plot like this. You enter through here and make a little court, like a kind of courtyard space with, so you have lines of buildings here and here and here. And there's a little game between the groupings of the buildings. So here you're looking at 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and the fourth is off the triangle, and the second is centered on the 3 on the triangle, so it makes this big gable. And likewise it's happening here in this group of 3, 1, 2, 3, and here you have the way in, little storage shed. And there's a plan. So this is just going on site. They're again simple brick buildings that play games with modest things like drain pipes, a real characteristic of London. And finally, just show you this project, which seemingly not so urban, but really for us was an urban project. So this is a client we have in the UK, Neil Hobhouse. He established Drawing Matters. You might have heard of this. And he lives here. And his family have had this estate a long time and have a long tradition for hiring architects to make, you could say, utilitarian buildings. Or, this was a horse stable, and there's a strong classical tradition in the estate. That's Palladio. That's an image of the material quality of this place. So he has a quarry on the site, and all the buildings, well, most of the buildings from this place are made from the quarry, and our building is called Cows, and it's a cow shed, and it's made from the same stuff from the same quarry, which is just through here. It's the stone from the quarry, and it's mixed with a little lime and put into molds. But this project, why is it an urban project? This is Peter Smithson's obelisk that was the last thing he did before he died. And this drawing is not very clear, I'm sorry, but if you can make that out, this is Smithson's obelisk here. This is his house, nice house. This is the house. This is the kitchen garden, very beautiful thing, you'll see. And then basically the estate has, there's a valley, and it turns like this, and it swoops down to this farm. And we've been doing a kind of, I won't call it a master plan, but a kind of site strategy for a series of new buildings that would, in a way, bring other uses to this place. And as I said, the client is a collector of drawings, of architectural drawings, in fact, In fact, I think he has a lot of Caesar's drawings. In fact, Caesar is making a little project here on these silos. And here's a little housing building, this cowshed, here's another building. And this is a view looking through the kitchen garden, the obelisk, and the valley as it sweeps around to the right. And this building, for cows, it's a simple off-the-shelf cowshed, has a kind of Palladian-like barcaza that is the tractor drive, where the tractor goes and drops the... But it's more than that. It's a threshold between the landscape up to the main house complex and a threshold into the collection of buildings. So here you're seeing the cowshed. This is a piece of landscaping, and the valley is like a V, and there's a little river, not very present today, but a water stream that comes around here, and then it's brought to the edge here, and then trickles through the valley like this. Here's one of the residents. It's nice to design a building that doesn't need insulation or too many regulatory things. We did a lot of experimentation in finding the right color and mix, and the engineer was very involved in compression of concrete strengths and so on, and we did this, we didn't like this is too much cement, this one's too much lime. So here's a view as you're looking to the face of the building, out. This is my Inigo Jones moment, where the colonnade meets the arch. I like copying things. I think it's quite okay to copy and to, I think somebody was saying the other night about you have to be new all the time and you have to invent. And I don't think that has to be the case. I think there's too much obsession with trying to be different. You will be different because you're doing it now in your time, with your hand, in this age, with the conditions that we have. These are photographs by David Grandorge, London photographer, very clever chap. And then there's another building opposite. So most of the buildings on this estate are stone, but some of them are they're small-scale, human-occupied buildings, you could say, in the farm, not in the grand house, are made from brick. And there is brick fields not very far. And we were asked to make a little building here, which is opposite the cowshed, and it's a little storage building with 2 storage rooms open to the elements, also uninsulated, a central place for the vehicles and machines. And it's a brick building that has these interconnected spaces. It has, I'm very proud of this because it's, and I have to give credit entirely to the structural engineer, really. But it's what you would describe as an inline truss. So it has no bracing. All the diagonals, it's quite hard to explain without drawings, but these diagonals are in compression and tension at the same time. So whilst the roof might want to splay apart, they hold it back. And he thinks, well, he thinks they used to do it in medieval England. So, and I think the other thing to say just about these 2 projects is they were quite unique in the client had on-site people. So we had the possibility to experiment with things without always drawing them first. So we had a loose idea about these columns, but we just tried them on site and then found an arrangement we liked. Okay. I'm going to stop there. That's enough. Thank you.